5 uses for the distinction between direct and overall liberty. I'll explain this in a second, but the idea is that a reform to the status quo can be thought of as having both direct effects in terms of liberty as well as indirect, adding up to overall, making for 2 different operators or rankings or assessments, direct and overall, 2 different liberties, as it were. And I want to use this distinction to talk about whether classical liberalism or libertarianism, and when I speak of liberalism today, I mean classical liberalism, is coherent. And is liberty talk itself coherent, since that's so central to classical liberal talk? To think about tensions between libertarians and conservatives, to talk about anarchy talk among libertarians, to interpret some different political theories. I'm going to draw on David Hume there in particular, and talk about the brighter side of the nation state. The distinction comes from Michael Clark and me, and we engaged in this exchange with Claudia Williamson and Walter Block. So I want to ask you to think about a reform like R1. Let's say R1 is lowering the minimum wage. And think about it being compared to another reform, R2, in terms of liberty. Now, R2 might not be a reform at all. So these R's here might also just be no reform, the status quo. This is all anchored in the status quo. And this is a simple operator here saying that R1 is higher in liberty than the status quo. Reducing the minimum wage would be an augmentation of liberty. Okay? I think that's pretty intuitive. And what we have here is a formulation of the liberty principle, which says, choose the one that's higher in liberty. Choosing being represented by an operator, desirability. R1 is more desirable than R2. Simple principle. Now, before going on, let me just note that there are a whole lot of possible reforms you can dream up, and it might be very hard to rank them in terms of liberty. What's higher in liberty? Abolishing the minimum wage, let's say that was R1, and R2 is, well, let's say liberalizing organ sales so that people can exchange organs for cash. Which one's higher in liberty? I don't know, but that's not usually how we actually formulate policy issues and talk about this. So we tend to actually, at least I do, formulate reforms and issues in terms of, in a sense, this liberty ranking. Now, this isn't like stated as a sort of absolute principle. Putting a by and large in front gives us a maxim, which is sort of what I'm in favor of championing. A maxim gives us a sort of presumption of liberty, such that the burden of proof is on the contravenor of the principle, like the presumption of innocence. Not that everybody's innocent, but there's a presumption of innocence, and the burden of proof is on the prosecution. Now, many people find a lot to object to in liberal talk and theory, and this operator right here is one thing that comes under attack. Suppose there are 2 ways of ranking 2 reforms in terms of liberty. Possible examples: deregulating savings and loans, like you liberalize what these financial institutions can do. That seems like an augmentation of liberty, but if those liberalizations lead to them to, as it were, making more bets for which the taxpayer is on the hook, and the taxpayer then bails out these players, and taxation itself is coercive, maybe overall we have less liberty. The 2008 bailouts have been discussed in this manner as well, as though not bailing out the institutions would have led to nationalizations and so on of the sectors, and even worse, governmentalization of affairs. U.S. entry into World War II, you're taxing people, you're conscripting people, you're dropping bombs on innocent Germans. But maybe getting rid of Hitler compensated for that indirectly, and overall, it was an overall increase in liberty? Possible disagreement between direct and overall. Legalizing bazookas. Some people might be concerned that you give people this increased indirect liberty of going out and buying a bazooka and mounting it over their mantle. But on the other hand, some people might cap off these bazookas, and these bazooka shells fall on other people's property and such. Maybe overall a decrease in liberty. Banning lead from gasoline. It's a direct violation of gasoline producers and gasoline buyers and so on. But if it reduces these lead particles in the air, which you might interpret as coercive, maybe overall it's an augmentation of liberty. Open borders. Directly, it's clearly an increase in augmentation in liberty, but through various political channels and dynamics, some argue it might lead to a reduction overall. So we have the direct effects, which are more or less inherent in the policy and its concomitant enforcement, which is sort of being presumed. And then there are other effects about what other people do, what happens in politics, and so on. And you can kind of think of adding those up to get overall. So in terms of scope and time frame considered, you can kind of think of any distance you want to go out, but there are 2 points on such a set that are focal: the immediate and direct and more or less inherent facets, and then there's the outer bound of all that we can kind of speculate on and think worth considering and taking into consideration if we want to think about what's the outcome for liberty. Now let me note that both of these are sort of in the, quote, negative liberty idea of liberty. This is not a matter of negative versus positive liberty. That doesn't really enter in here. And so we've seen, I've suggested some examples where, in terms of these now more refined operators, direct liberty, ordering, and overall liberty, we could have R1 being greater by direct, but less by overall, and so disagreement between direct and overall. And so will the real liberty please stand up? I did a dry run of this talk with Eric, and he didn't know where that expression came from. I don't know how many of you ever saw the Tell the Truth, but I was like, oh my goodness. Anyway, I think usually we mean direct liberty. I intend us to, as it were, continue to mean direct liberty. And for one very good, important reason, that it's much more concrete and determinate. We can agree much more clearly that reducing the minimum wage by $1 and so on is an augmentation of liberty. We can focus on that as almost precise and accurate and grammatical, and then talk about its consequences and so on. And that really gives a kind of spine and backbone to a lot of our thinking and formulations. But it's only part of the liberty story, so it's got that downside. And that makes you think that maybe the overall is a better thing to focus on. It's the whole liberty story, but its big minus is that it's much less concrete and determinate. The overall liberty operator, while it has the overall whole liberty story, is much less concrete and determinate. So that's its big minus. And this brings us to the first use to which we put, Michael Clark and I did put the distinction between direct and overall. That is to address whether the problems, the disagreements between direct and overall are rife and unmanageable. If they are, then the critics of liberalism, the critics of this whole idea of liberty, have a very good point or on very solid ground of saying, hey, this problem is just too rife and unmanageable. A lot of your liberty talk, we don't really know which you mean and which we should mean, and it just is illusory, meaningless, not the way to approach things. So to address this, Michael and I came up with different areas of possible disagreement between direct and overall to think out all of the topics people speak of disagreement between direct and overall. These are not mutually exclusive, they overlap, and I'm not sure that they're complete, but we tried to think out all of the ones that seem to arise and be relevant. So and we gave them names, like Thoreauvian coercion. Private coercion might undo larger coercions. Coercive hazard, the idea that if the government deregulates, say, certain financial practices, the private players are then freed up to, as it were, make bets for which the taxpayers are on the hook in the event of bad results. And so although they are freed up to make those bets, as it were, there might be more coercion overall from the taxpayers paying the bill later, taxation itself being coercive. Disarming or defusing private coercion, like private ownership of arms, maybe curfews during urban riots. Controlling pollution. So these things, military actions, toppling someone who's an even worse coercer, an even worse liberty violator than the liberty violations involved in toppling such bad guys, and so on. And our overall conclusion was that many of the topics that we laid out, which I haven't shown you, in fact, are not serious problems for disagreement between direct and overall, that generally speaking, direct and overall do tend to go along as we would expect, but that there are some areas where disagreement is much more plausible and should be taken more seriously. We shouldn't just presume that there's no problem at all. To some extent, we can segment and hive off these different areas, recognize them, learn to deal with them. The ones we thought that are particularly important are the coercive hazard, the controlling pollution, the moral foundations and political dynamics, particularly with respect to massive immigration. I myself do not have a very strong position on this, but I certainly don't feel comfortable just declaring that open borders will be fine. And military actions. Again, it's not that I think that overall trumps direct so much here. I just think we don't know, and we should be take very seriously concerns about disagreements and arguments to say that they do disagree. We concluded by giving this quotation by Simon Newcomb, which I really like. I want to read it. Newcomb says, "It is not claimed that such propositions," this is propositions like free trade is desirable, "should be taught dogmatically as if they were theorems of geometry. Not only should their limitations be pointed out when necessary, but the student should be encouraged to find or even to imagine conditions under which the maxim would fail. In doing this, the vice he should be taught to avoid is that of concluding that because he can imagine a state of things under which a maxim would fail, therefore it is worthless." So just because it's not 100%, just because there are exceptions, doesn't mean that the maxim or the principle is undone, should be set aside, has been defeased, and is of no value. We work with principles even that aren't 100%, even that admit of exceptions. They still carry presumptions. They still work as by and larges. They can still organize our thought. This sort of attitude was very typical of the Scottish thinkers. We see it in many of them, not just Hume and Smith, but others as well. And it's very different than a lot of the 20th century thinkers. For example, Mises and Rothbard in economics, and Rothbard in political ethics. Okay, on to use two. To address tensions between libertarians and conservatives. Conservatives, I think, see more disagreement between direct and overall liberty than do libertarians. Conservatives is sort of code for Republicans, of course, and Republicanism. And here, I'm thinking of what I would, the conservatives I respect the most. I'm not talking about the whole rank and file and so on, but I'd like to, I'm focusing on the George Wills, the William F. Buckleys, the Jonah Goldbergs, and so on. And I think that, first of all, some of these fellows might put more stock in some of those, what we thought were, Michael and I thought were less important areas of possible disagreement. For example, restrictions to prevent rip-offs, the idea that we need some consumer protection things in occupational licensing and OSHA and the FDA. I don't think that George Will is a champion of any of these by any means, but I do think that Republicans are a little bit more accepting of the idea that these so-called consumer protection restrictions do in fact reduce rip-offs and other forms of coercion, private coercion, by virtue of these controls and so-called certifications and assurances. I just think that those consequences are not that significant in the first place in a free market. I think the market forces have ways of dealing with that, and other voluntary associations and organizations. So I think that conservatives sort of buy into some of the claims about disagreement a little too readily. And this is more true the further down you go in the sort of conservative pyramid, if you will. Further down you go. Taxing to fund liberal enlightenment, using the state to advance classical liberal ideas and values. This was a point that Hayek made in his famous essay about conservatives. Military actions, I just think conservatives see more overall liberty benefit to more military actions than libertarians generally do. Coercing to tend the moral foundations of liberty. I think of the old debate between Frank Meyer, the fusionist, and Brent Bozell. I think it's the father of the guy you sometimes see on TV, where Bozell says we perhaps need restrictions on pornography and prostitution and things like that, prescription, because that helps to develop and nurture and train the moral foundations necessary for liberty. And Meyer's more of a libertarian conservative on such matters. Before explaining this last one, let me point out that a contrast between libertarianism and republicanism. Libertarianism has been described as a movement with a head and no body. There are libertarian thinkers and there are think tanks where people think, as it were, but there's no mass movement as such. And in a way, this is a luxury for libertarians. In one way, it's frustrating and maybe prevents them from getting as much place at the cultural table as they would like. But in some ways, it's a luxury because you don't have to worry so much about, you know, mobilizing and herding your body of the movement, whereas republicanism is a head and a body, you know, all the way down to everyone who votes Republican, as it were. And so conservatives are more concerned with what Adam Smith called the art of politics. He didn't specifically use that term, but he implied such a term when he spoke of his distinction between the science of a legislator, as represented by his book, The Wealth of Nations, and the art practiced by that insidious and crafty animal, the statesman or politician. And because republicanism is more involved, and necessarily so because it has a body, as it were, in the art of politics, it has to log roll for liberty, as we put it here. But this is a matter, these kinds of things are a matter more of, if you will, the art of politics, rather than the science of a legislator, And that was sort of Smith's response about some of these particular political moves about trade restrictions, trade wars, retaliations of the insidious and crafty animal. So that's another reason why, in a way, libertarians are able to sort of dodge disagreement maybe more easily than conservatives and Republicans. Moving on, I think the distinction's also useful in explaining why I find dissatisfying a lot of the anarchy talk among libertarians, libertarian anarchists. This is the title page, the front page of the Competitive Enterprise Institute's 10,000 Commandments, their review of federal regulation. I love this title, 10,000 Commandments. It makes me think of Smith's criticism of casuistry in the ending of The Wealth of Nations, where I think Smith was tacitly, in fact, referring to just this kind of problem and criticizing just this kind of lawmaking. Anyway, 10,000. Anarchy would seem to be about eliminating all 10,000 government interventions at once. Some sort of grand R-star reform, pushing this button with all this stuff rolled up into it, abolishing all government interventions. Now, one thing to think about, I mean, it's very hard to enter, I find it very hard to enter into any such thought experiment. Or I don't even find it hard, I just find it not that meaningful. What would be the indirect liberty effects of some such thing? I think people are not facing up to, if they think this kind of a thing can be achieved, let's say within the next 500 years anyway, I think they're not facing up to sort of human frailty, human meaning, what people find meaning in. And also it raises all these questions about the cultural assumptions of the thought experiment. And so much of any discussion of the thought experiment would depend on those cultural assumptions, which seem to get, gradually perhaps drawn out only once you start talking about them. And I just don't find those things very, very satisfying. It's really not so much just a matter of the political infeasibility of a R-star anarchy button. I mean, I don't think it's very politically feasible to think about abolishing, say, the FDA. But I think that it's very meaningful. It's much more meaningful to talk about abolishing the FDA, imagining the world going on without an FDA. I think that's somehow meaningful in a way that I don't find R-star so meaningful. I prefer to confine abolitionism to sort of one issue at a time, to abolish one government agency per conversation, if we so decide. And to elaborate on this, I want to speak of a distinction between jural monism and jural dualism. This is just a little bit about the word jural from Black's Law Dictionary, pertaining to natural or positive right, or the doctrines of right and obligations, as in jural relations. So in the theory of moral sentiments, we work with and encounter two different sorts of jural relationships. The equal relationship, and that is like you and your neighbor, you and your coworkers, you and your employer, you and your employees. Those are all voluntary relationships. Everyone's expected and assumed to respect commutative justice, and you are interacting as equals even if you are unequal in other specific respects that are not jural respects. Then there is the superior-inferior relationship, and this is essentially the governor and the governed. Okay, and this relationship crosses the commutative justice grammar. The superior violates commutative justice, institutionalizes violations of commutative justice. In explaining the superior, Smith, in his famous superior paragraph, varies terms. He speaks of the laws, the lawgiver, the sovereign, the magistrate. So Smith holds this jural dualism. He accepts and works with both of these relationships. Monism rejects the superior-inferior relationship. And that rejection or evasion takes a couple of different forms. And I think this monism might be seen as a vestige of the ancestral band, something that I know you're very interested in. In the ancestral band, where our genes are from, they haven't changed that much in the last 10,000 years. We've gotten more lactose tolerant, we've gotten smarter, but my understanding, and I think it's quite well agreed and established, is that we really haven't changed that much in the last 10,000 years. We're still basically Upper Paleolithic. Is that up to 10,000 years ago, we were in these small bands of 30, 40 people, and we had an alpha male, as it were. Generally, it wasn't a male, but my understand. And he was like more of a first among equals. He wasn't a dictator, if for no other reason than because anybody could kill anybody, as Travis Bickle put it famously in Taxi Driver. Did you ever see that movie? You should. He found out that he couldn't kill anybody, which was very frustrating to him, and just showed that he wasn't in the band anymore, which in a way might be what the whole movie is sort of about. Anyway, many libertarians accept only the equal-equal relationship, which again I feel is sort of in our genes and is one of these atavisms Hayek tells us we need to overcome. But who is it that executes this anarchy R star? I suppose it's the government. And when the government executes R star, does it annihilate its own superiorhood? Does it annihilate also its role in executing such things, in being this openly recognized exceptional player who institutionalizes its own violations of commutative justice? That's an interesting question, and and of course is hard to imagine. For my part, I think we should just accept and expect the government continuing to exist, and recognizing the government has at least one necessary and important function, namely dismantling other government functions. Now, I think, affirming the dualism, jural dualism, is not to sort of embrace and recognize or advocate expansions of the superior-inferior relationship. In fact, I think the underlying drift of Smith's work, and even especially, I don't know if I'd say especially, but even very much so, the theory of moral sentiments, is that because the equal-equal relationships work well and the superior-inferior relationships don't work well, we should try to have social affairs managed, happening in terms of the equal-equal relationship as much as possible, rather than the superior-inferior relationship, which is to say we should degovernmentalize social affairs, and we should not sort of push for the governmentalization. So I'm all in favor of like the libertarian idea of trying to minimize the scope of the superior-inferior relationship, and many libertarian scholars show that justice and other norms, voluntary provision of public goods, happen spontaneously, emerge spontaneously. These are great points, and I'm all in favor of working working on them and promoting them and making them and showing them. But I don't really think they should be framed in terms of anarchy. I think that becomes a red herring and a distraction. I think it's better to talk about voluntary provision, spontaneous emergence through voluntary processes, degovernmentalization, not governmentalizing things, and so on. There's all sorts of words you can use other than anarchy, which is somehow about pushing this overall no more government button or getting to some place like that. And when we talk about these good points about how voluntary processes work and voluntary society can work, I don't really think we're speaking to the issue of jural monism versus jural dualism. The government could even get out of the commutative justice business and still exist. It could still tax people and be a government, and so on. In general, I think that libertarian talk of anarchy appeals to an instinctual jural monism, but without really mounting much of a case for monism over dualism. Okay. On to use 4, interpreting political theories. And here I draw on Hume's of the original contract. He speaks about two parties, the Tories and the Whigs. I've got a few quotations to read. About the Tories, he says, "The one party, by tracing up government to the deity, endeavor to render it, government, so sacred and inviolate, less than sacrilege, however tyrannical it may become, to touch or invade it in the smallest article." So the Tories totally disapprove of resisting the government. And about the Whigs, he says, "The other party, by founding government altogether on the consent of the people, suppose that there is a kind of original contract by which the subjects have tacitly reserved the power of resisting their sovereign whenever they find themselves aggrieved by that authority, with which they have, for certain purposes, voluntarily entrusted him." And he continues, says a little more about the Whigs. "This promise on the part of the subject, this promise is always understood to be conditional and imposes on him no obligation unless he meet with justice and protection from his sovereign. These advantages the sovereign promises him in return. And if he fail in the execution, he has broken on his part the articles of engagement and has thereby freed his subject from all obligations to allegiance." Okay. Now, Hume makes many objections to the Whig doctrine. He was a big critic of social contract theory. And one of them is as follows, I read, "Nor has the most noted of the Whig doctrine's partisans, in prosecution of it, scrupled to affirm that the supreme power in a state cannot take from any man, by taxes and impositions, any part of his property without his own consent or that of his representatives." So Hume is pointing out here that although the Whigs speak as though the original contract specifies liberty, in fact, they approve of institutions that violate liberty. So what's going on here? So this is where I see the distinction between direct and overall, useful. The Whig could respond, and I think maybe tacitly this is how we can think of Locke and Sidney and so on thinking. Yes, we see the original contract as specifying a term about liberty, but it's overall liberty, okay? So the government's charge is not to always augment and secure and protect direct liberty, it's to protect and augment overall liberty. Okay? And that's how they could salvage this and get around this point that Hume just made. Now, Hume might respond in turn, okay, but contracts are supposed to be precise and accurate and grammatical, right? And whether acts reduce overall liberty is very unclear, as we've already discussed. We will disagree often about whether these actions advance overall liberty or reduce it. And I think Hume in the essay is suggesting that maybe overall liberty is best served by not thinking of political theory at all. And Hume says, and I think this is kind of the important drift and point, in a way, prescience of Hume's piece, when we assert that all lawful government arises from the consent of the people, we certainly do them a great deal more honor than they deserve. And he illustrates this by referring to Socrates in Crito. He says, quote, "Socrates refuses to escape from prison because he had tacitly promised to obey the laws. He thus builds a Tory consequence of passive obedience on a Whig foundation of original contract." And in a way, as I say, I think this kind of gets at the danger of political consent theories, that it's very easy for people to slide from this sort of tacit, what is implicit perhaps in Locke, of an overall liberty idea, to basically dropping liberty or redefining liberty, as of course happened at the end of the 19th century. And in this way, this brings us to the Social Democrats and how they as well can be seen as a form of jural monism. Whereas the libertarian anarchists want to annihilate the superior-inferior relationship, the Social Democrats deny it by saying that the government is but a variety of the equal, okay? And this is based on the idea of the polity as one big organization, kind of like a hotel or a club, that presupposes, if only tacitly, that there's some sort of substructure underneath the polity, if you will, that is collectively owned by the people, the state in the Hegelian sense, and your private stuff, not only your car and your basketball and whatever, but even your soil, right, is sitting on top of this collective thing, thereby dependent upon it and implicitly in a contract with this collective owner, this overlord, if you will. So that's why Social Democrats, the left, don't see things like the minimum wage law as coercive, because to them, all those laws, those 10,000 commandments, are all just rules of the hotel, the club, that you have agreed to voluntarily by voluntarily choosing to be in the hotel. If you don't like those rules, if you don't like this package deal, you're free to leave. Get off of our substructure, essentially. So this is the big rift in political thought. It ended really, I mean, there was all this Rousseau and everybody else before, but it was at the end of the 19th century that, you know, the transition and the breakdown of liberal semantics really occurred, and where this kind of thinking became dominant and remains dominant, or at least dominant enough to completely confuse things today. And it's based on a different configuration of ownership, okay? So sorting out some of these ideas, I have this scheme here. We have the two overlordist theories, the social democracy we just talked about, where there's a collective ownership of the substructure of the polity, if you will, and then there's political consent with that overlord, okay? And that's actually very much like the Tories, for whom the ownership was held by the king, and you are, as it were, at his hotel, and you don't have a right to resist him either, right? Because it's kind of like you're a guest at his hotel. So we see, in this respect, the Social Democrats are like the Tories. But the Social Democrats have a consent theory, and now it's a little different than the Whig consent theory. The Whig consent, the Lockeans, and you see I have some names here of people who I think represent this. This is all a bit speculative. I confess I'm no expert on these thinkers. I'm pretty strong in Hume and Smith. But beyond that, I'm going from impressions, I'd say. Anyway, the Whig theory, it's also a contract theory, but in their idea, you do own your land, as it were, down to the core of the earth. And then these private individuals notionally have a contract with each other, creating this government to protect their overall liberty, in my interpretation. And so there is no overlord, but there is a contract theory. And you can kind of think of Hume saying, hey, this contract theory can easily sort of bleed into, and it's like a slippery slope or something. So he said, let's not do consent theory at all, and let's be real clear that these, when the government treads on liberty, they are initiating coercion, okay? So the Hume-Smith column at the end is what I call the conventionalist view of government. I think it's fair to say it was shared by Hayek. I think it's quite clear that it was shared by Josiah Tucker. I think Burke is a reasonable thing there. Do you think so as well? And so suppose the government has been treading on liberty, and I have liberty here with an asterisk, kind of based on we need a specified director overall. Is resistance justified? In social democracy and in Tory, the answer is no. It's sort of like, hey, this is what the government's doing. And for the social democracy case, we'll assume that it's according to their rules, as it were, of democracy. Like we said before, it's not treading on liberty. Those are the rules. If you don't like the minimum wage, you're free to leave the hotel, as it were. But the Whigs, if it's a train of things that tread on overall liberty in their view, like, say, 20th century United States, they would say, yes, resistance is justified. As for Hume and Smith, they say maybe, depends. It's a different kind of call for them about whether or not you should actually rebel in any sort of violent or disorderly way. It all depends, and it's not really based on any of these notions of consent or even liberty, really. It's not directly dependent or determined by any such considerations. And then are such actions initiations of coercion? Again, no for the Social Democrats. I'm really not clear quite on what to say for the Tory. The Whigs, again, if it's violations of overall liberty, like if we just think of the 20th century, they would say yes, and Hume and Smith say yes. And this is very important because it's important to see of coercion. And in dealing with the left, the big problem is right at that beginning point, really. Okay. Hume and Smith were jural dualists. They were post-1688 writers. They sort of presupposed a stable polity. And I think our political liberalism generally presupposes a sort of a setting of a stable polity. And again, that sort of jural dualism. And this brings us to our fifth and final use for the distinction between direct and overall. And that's the brighter side of nation states. This is Brad Pitt from the movie Fury. Ideals are peaceful. History is violent. History demonstrates that evil and illiberalism is not only top-down, it is also bottom-up and side-to-side. A good case could be made that many nation-states have augmented overall liberty, even though in the course of doing so they've trampled direct liberty. Daniel Hannan, a British author, says, it is extremely rare to find justice, freedom, or representative government flourishing in any context other than a nation state. And if that's true, and I'm inclined to think that it probably is, we can learn by appreciating the best ones, the best nation states. And that is one way of thinking about why the British or Anglo experience is so central and should be so central. This is a quotation from James Campbell. I lifted it from Hannan's book. He's an Oxford historian. He says, let me state a certainty. Late Anglo-Saxon England, that is, I don't know, around 900, 1000, before the Norman Conquest. Late Anglo-Saxon England was a nation state. It was an entity with effective central authority, uniformly organized institutions, a national language, a national church, defined frontiers, and above all, a strong sense of national identity. And in the whole movement from status to contract, historical movement, best seen in Britain, from status to contract, that's the expression of Henry Sumner Maine in his famous book, Ancient Law. It's a movement that sort of reflects and represents the movement towards liberalism. Hannon asks, what catalyzed the shift from status to contract in Britain? And he lists 5 things. I'm just going to mention the first: the development of a nation state. That is, a regime able to apply laws more or less uniformly to a population bound together by a shared identity. By a sense of shared identity. All right, so I think the nation state deserves more respect, at least when the good ones, certainly. I think the nation state arguably is almost a precondition, at least has been historically, for the development of liberalism and liberal life. So I've talked about 5 uses for the distinction. They're shown here. I wanted to do this talk because although I've had the opportunity with Michael Clark of writing only about the first one, I just find that the distinction seems useful in many different areas of thought, and so this is an opportunity to elaborate its potentials. Thank you so much.